Imagine leaving office with this just sky-high 80% approval rating.
Right, which is huge.
Yeah, exactly. You're being globally praised for presiding over this, period of remarkable economic growth, massive infrastructure development, overall national stability.
Your citizens literally love you.
They do, and by all conventional political metrics, you are just a historic success. Yet, simultaneously, top political scientists and human rights observers around the world are looking at your exact same tenure and labeling you a grave threat to the fundamental foundations of democracy.
It's such a wild paradox.
Right. You are paradoxically the hero of the people and the absolute villain of the democratic theorists.
Which is a profound contradiction, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it forces us to completely reevaluate how we even measure the health of a political system.
Yeah.
Because usually, we look for really obvious villains in the story of democratic decline, like military juntas, violent coups, suspended constitutions.
The classic strongman stuff.
Exactly. But the erosion we are examining today, it happened right out in the open. Not with tanks in the streets, but with the enthusiastic applause of the voting public.
Which brings us to today's topic. We are heading to the world's third largest democracy. Welcome to episode 2 of our Reading C series, where we focus on Southeast Asia. And today we are doing a deep dive into the political landscape of Indonesia.
And specifically, we're looking at the decade-long rule of Joko Widodo.
Yeah, universally known as Jokowi. He served as president from 2014 until he stepped down recently in October 2024. And for anyone tuning in, I want you to basically put on the hat of a university student who's studying Indonesian political history.
Okay, I like that framing.
Yeah, the mission for this deep dive is to analyze this era and definitively answer this really complex question. Was Jokowi democracy's protector, or was he its undertaker?
To really guide this analysis, we are relying on a highly influential piece of academic research. Our foundational text today is a 2025 paper by Marcus Mietzner. It was published in the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs, and it's titled Flirting with Autocracy in Indonesia, Jokowi's Majoritarianism and Its Democratic Legacy.
And Mietzner is, he's an associate professor at the Australian National University, right?
Yes, he is. And his work is it provides incredibly detailed polling data and these amazing behind-the-scenes insights into the decision-making processes of the Indonesian executive branch over the last 10 years.
Now, just real quick before we get into it, because the source material touches on some really politically charged themes, the mechanics of democracy, definitions of autocracy, human rights, internal politics of a sovereign nation. We need to establish a clear baseline of impartiality here.
Absolutely.
We are not taking any political sides. Our role here is strictly to act as guides. We're impartially unpacking the viewpoints, the statistical data, and the scholarly arguments that are presented in Mietzner's academic text.
Yeah, we're simply conveying the ideas and the raw facts contained in the original source material, just to help you understand the scholarly debate.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this. To really grasp the magnitude of Jokowi's actions during his presidency, we kind of have to contextualize the political environment he inherited, right?
We have to rewind to 1998.
The big one.
Yeah, that year is the absolute watershed moment, like the year zero for modern Indonesian democracy. Because prior to 1998, for roughly 3 decades, Indonesia was ruled by President Suharto under the system known as the New Order.
And the New Order was, it was a heavily centralized autocratic regime.
Completely. It relied on this doctrine called Dwaifungsi, or dual function, which formally embedded the military into every single level of civilian government and society.
Wow.
Yeah, there was this immense concentration of power and wealth within a really tight circle of military generals and business cronies.
But then the collapse of that system, it wasn't a peaceful transition at all.
No, not at all.
The 1998 Asian financial crisis absolutely devastated the Indonesian economy. The currency collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, and that economic pain triggered massive nationwide popular uprisings.
The student protests were huge.
Right. And all that intense social unrest eventually forced Suharto to resign. But the architects of the new democratic system that emerged from that chaos, a period that's known as reformasi, they had this one overriding traumatic memory driving their decisions.
Right, they were totally traumatized by the New Order.
Exactly. They were determined to build a political straitjacket that would make it structurally impossible for one person to ever consolidate that much power again.
Yeah, that reformasi period, spanning roughly from 1998 to 2004, It involved massive constitutional surgery.
I love that phrase, constitutional surgery.
Right, because the entire post-1998 framework was designed around the radical dispersal of power. They instituted strict separation of powers, created these powerful new independent watchdogs, and pushed for massive decentralization.
Meaning they stripped power from the capital and handed it out to regional districts.
Exactly. And, crucially, they established absolute term limits for the presidency. A president gets a maximum of 2 5-year terms, period.
Which forces power to be shared, right?
Yeah, among a really broad spectrum of elite players, political parties, civil society organizations, Muslim organizations, the bureaucracy.
So it's essentially an elaborate immune system designed to reject another strongman.
That's a great way to put it.
And if we look purely at the structural survival of that system, it performed, honestly, miraculously well under Jokowi. Indonesia actually celebrated its 25th anniversary as an electoral democracy during his tenure.
Which is a huge deal. Mietzner actually emphasizes this by contrasting Indonesia with its regional neighbors.
Right, because Southeast Asia has had a rough time lately.
Yeah, throughout the 21st century, the rest of Southeast Asia presents a very gloomy picture for democratic health.
Oh, totally. While Indonesia was successfully holding these regular, massive logistical exercises to elect its leaders, look at what was happening around them.
Yeah, Myanmar suffered a tragic, violent return to a military dictatorship.
Right.
Thailand saw its fragile democratic institutions systematically dismantled by an alliance between the military and the monarchy.
And then there's the Philippines.
Yeah, flirting heavily with violent authoritarianism and extrajudicial killings under Rodrigo Duterte. So the mere fact that Indonesian democracy structurally survived Jokowi's decade in power without reverting to military rule or suspending the constitution is, comparatively speaking, a massive positive chapter.
Okay, but survival is, it's a measurable baseline, but it's also a very low bar.
It is a low bar.
And this is where the scholarly community looking at Indonesia violently fractures. Like, we have these brilliant, highly respected political scientists analyzing the exact same 10-year period of Jokowi's rule, looking at the same elections and economic data.
And they were reaching wildly contradictory conclusions about his legacy.
Exactly. So what are the two camps?
Well, the academic landscape is broadly divided into the optimists and the critics.
Let's start with the optimists.
Okay, so on the optimist side, we have scholars like Dan Slater. Slater analyzes the political landscape and argues that Jokowi left behind a, quote, surprisingly high-quality democracy that citizens were mostly content with. Yeah, the optimist argument focuses on the stability of the state, the unbroken chain of regular elections, and the fact that Jokowi maintained a broad, inclusive political coalition that prevented extreme polarization.
So they view the avoidance of systemic collapse as a triumph.
Right, a triumph of democratic resilience.
But then the critics, they focus on a completely different set of metrics.
Oh, completely.
Researchers like Sana Jaffrey and Eve Warburton point to unprecedented interference by the state apparatus in the 2024 elections.
Which is a huge deal.
Yeah, they highlight the overwhelming dominance of oligarchic power cartels, widespread transactional politics, vote buying, and severely worsening human rights conditions.
And scholars Saiful Mujani and R. William Little are even more direct. They argue that Jokowi systematically sidelined democracy and inflicted a vast amount of damage on the country's institutional integrity.
Jaffrey and Warburton actually argued that the scale and brazenness of Jokowi's electoral interventions were reminiscent of elections under Suharto's autocratic rule, which is a heavy accusation.
It's massive.
But, I mean, how can these brilliant scholars look at the exact same 10-year period and reach completely opposite conclusions? It's like looking at an architectural inspection where half the engineers say the house is perfectly stable and the others say the foundation is rotting away.
That's a really good analogy. The divergence in these scholarly assessments comes down to a fundamental disagreement over what actually constitutes a healthy democracy.
Right.
The optimists are measuring formal survival. They're looking at the formal architecture. Did the country hold multi-party elections? Did the parliament convene and pass laws? Did the president respect the formal two-term limit?
And because those structural beams of electoral democracy remain standing, they declare the system stable.
Exactly. But the critics, conversely, are measuring qualitative substance. They're examining civil liberties, the genuine independence of anti-corruption agencies, the neutrality of the judiciary, and, the freedom of the press to operate without fear of state reprisal.
So the formal architecture survived, but the qualitative substance was severely decayed. To understand how a leader can hollow out the qualitative substance of a democracy without triggering a systemic collapse, and in fact, while maintaining an 80% approval rating, we have to examine his unique operational philosophy.
Yes. Jokowi operated on a doctrine of extreme, poll-driven majoritarianism.
Majoritarianism. Let's define that, because it's a concept with a complex history in political science, right?
It is. In modern democratic theory, it's actually frequently used as a pejorative term.
Like an insult.
Yeah, pretty much. It describes a scenario where a leader claims that simply winning a numerical majority in an election provides an absolute mandate to execute their agenda, regardless of established institutional rules or the rights of minority groups.
So it carries the implication of the tyranny of the majority.
Right, where 51% of the population can legally suppress the other 49% without consequence.
But Jokowi didn't view majoritarianism as despotic or tyrannical at all.
Not even a little bit.
He viewed it as the ultimate, purest form of democracy. His operating principle was straightforward. Democracy is the process of figuring out exactly what the majority of the people want and then executing it.
Right. It was not about adhering to complex, abstract, procedural norms or moral absolutes.
Yeah.
For him, it was a pragmatic exercise in fulfilling the popular will.
And his deep belief in this philosophy traces directly back to his political origin story.
Yeah, because unlike many of his predecessors or rivals, Jokowi was not a military general.
Right.
Nor was he the scion of a historic political dynasty or a prominent religious cleric. He was literally a furniture exporter who entered local politics as the mayor of a central Java city called Solo.
And he built his reputation on a political innovation called blusukan.
Blusukan, yes.
It roughly translates to impromptu site inspections, but in practice it was this hyper-localized form of retail politics. As mayor of Solo, and later during his highly successful run for the governorship of Jakarta, Jokowi completely bypassed traditional bureaucratic reporting.
Yeah, he physically went down into traditional markets.
Into the poorest, flood-prone residential areas and spoke directly with everyday citizens. He wasn't giving speeches from a podium. He was wading through mud, asking vendors and residents directly about their immediate needs and grievances.
And that direct engagement cultivated an aura of extreme humility and accessibility. I mean, it also yielded an unbroken track record of electoral success.
He never lost.
Never. He won 2 mayoral races in Solo, the massive and highly competitive Jakarta gubernatorial race, and ultimately 2 national presidential elections in 2014 and 2019.
And that perfect streak instilled in him this unshakable confidence that he possessed a unique, almost supernatural intuition for the true desires of the Indonesian electorate.
Right. But he didn't rely solely on this intuition. He systemized it.
Yeah, Mietzner's research details how Jokowi became an almost fanatic consumer of opinion polls. He developed an extensive, highly sophisticated network of pollsters and political advisors.
He spent hours every single week poring over granular data, constantly testing his political instincts against hard statistical numbers.
He meticulously tracked public sentiment on every conceivable policy issue. He explicitly stated in an interview with Mietzner, quote, "I find out what the people want by reading the polls."
He transformed the executive branch into a polling democracy.
Which is fascinating, but what exactly did those polls reveal about what the public actually wanted?
Well, the polling data revealed a profound disconnect between what Western political science assumes citizens value in a democracy and what the Indonesian electorate actually prioritizes.
Right. The source material highlights this critical study asking Indonesian citizens to identify the most essential characteristic of a democracy. And the results fundamentally challenge the whole liberal democratic framework.
Yeah. The numbers are wild. When presented with a list of core democratic features, only 10% of Indonesians viewed competitive multi-party elections as the most essential characteristic.
Only 10%.
And only 8% prioritized a free media capable of criticizing the government.
So if it's not elections and it's not free press, what is it?
A massive 45% of respondents stated that the defining characteristic of a democracy is when the government ensures job opportunities for all.
Wow, 45%.
Yeah. And another 22% said the primary function of democracy is when the government ensures law and order.
Okay, so for nearly 70% of the population, democracy is not defined by civil liberties or electoral procedures.
No, it's defined by economic deliverables and social stability. If citizens have employment, infrastructure, and security, They consider themselves to be living in a successful democracy.
Which is what political scientists categorize as a developmentalist definition of democracy.
Exactly. And Jokowi's personal philosophy aligned perfectly with this data. He viewed economic prosperity as the ultimate goal of the state, and democracy merely as the current vehicle to achieve it.
Right. He was famously quoted asking, "What is the point of democracy if it doesn't lead to prosperity?"
Right. Operating from this developmentalist mindset, if the overwhelming majority prioritizes economic welfare, then any procedural norm, bureaucratic regulation, or minority complaint that impedes economic development can be legitimately bypassed.
Which isolates a very specific demographic in Indonesia, the marginalized 9%.
Yes, the 9%.
Because the polling data indicated that only about 9% of the electorate consistently held deep ideological commitments to liberal democratic values, the voters who prioritize human rights, freedom of expression, strict institutional checks and balances above economic deliverables.
And from a pure numbers perspective, a majoritarian leader does not need 9% of the vote to govern or to maintain a high approval rating.
But, and here's the catch, Jokowi did need that liberal 9% to secure his initial rise to national power.
Oh, absolutely he did. During the intensely fought 2014 and 2019 presidential campaigns, his primary opponent was Prabowo Subianto.
Right, and Prabowo was a former Kopassus Special Forces commander with a deeply controversial history.
Yeah, including serious allegations of human rights abuses during the 1998 unrest. Prabowo represented for many the acute threat of a return to military-backed strongman rule.
So, recognizing this dynamic, Jokowi actively courted that liberal voting bloc. He heavily tailored his campaign messaging to appeal to civil society activists and human rights advocates.
He constantly emphasized his civilian background, framing himself as a leader free of the historical baggage of the new order.
And the liberal 9%, terrified of a Prabowo presidency, threw their entire organizational weight behind Jokowi. They viewed him as the essential firewall against democratic regression.
But, once the elections were won and the mandate was secured, the majoritarian math completely shifted.
Right. Having secured the presidency, Jokowi rapidly marginalized the liberal agenda. He confided to Mietzner that he didn't actually believe the liberal voters were the decisive factor in his victories.
Because the polling told him he won, because the vast mainstream majority viewed him as a humble, hardworking champion of development.
So he felt zero political obligation to the 9%. Zero. He pivoted entirely to governing for the demographic center of mass, focusing exclusively on infrastructure, welfare distribution, and foreign investment.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Applying majoritarianism to economics is one thing, but applying it to religion in an incredibly diverse nation like Indonesia is highly complex.
Extremely complex.
Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim-majority country, but it also has significant Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist populations. Majoritarianism often devolves into the dominant religious group systematically oppressing minorities. How did Jokowi's polling-driven approach navigate this potential volatility?
Well, the polling data provided a very specific roadmap for religious coalition building. You see, Indonesian Islam is not a monolithic voting bloc.
Right.
It is characterized by massive traditional organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, which encompass a wide spectrum of theological and political views.
And the data bore this out.
Yeah, a pivotal 2016 survey revealed that approximately 58.5% of Indonesian Muslims identified as pluralists.
Okay, 58.5%. Right. These voters supported maintaining the secular nature of the Indonesian state and opposed the implementation of strict Islamic law, or the formal Islamization of government institutions.
And what about the rest?
The remaining 41.5% held more Islamist-leaning opinions, favoring a greater role for religion in the state.
So the pluralist Muslim demographic already constitutes a numerical majority. Jokowi then factored in the country's religious minorities, who make up roughly 12% of the total population.
Exactly. And by aligning the 58.5% pluralist Muslims with the 12% religious minorities, he identified a massive, dominant majoritarian bloc.
This coalition was mathematically overwhelming.
It was. And they were fiercely committed to protecting religious pluralism against the Islamist factions, which, largely align with his political rivals.
And this is a big but while this majoritarian coalition fiercely defended religious freedom and the secular constitution, they were not liberal progressives.
None at all. The polling clearly demonstrated that this pluralist bloc remained deeply socially conservative.
Right. The source points to a 2018 survey indicating that a staggering 88% of respondents, cutting across all religious affiliations and political alignments, viewed the LGBT community as a fundamental threat to society.
Yeah, so Jokowi's strategy was to govern precisely at the intersection of these majoritarian desires.
He aggressively protected religious pluralism,
He relentlessly prioritized economic infrastructure,
and he completely ignored or actively suppressed progressive social issues. He found the exact center of the electorate and entrenched himself there.
which is incredibly savvy. And once he established a total understanding of what the majority valued, and equally importantly, what they considered irrelevant, he began a systematic process of testing the boundaries of the 1998 democratic framework.
Because if the polling data consistently shows that the public only cares about job creation and social stability, a pragmatic leader can begin dismantling the institutional checks and balances that slow down executive action.
Provided the public does not express significant outrage.
Exactly. Political scientists describe this specific methodology as executive aggrandizement.
Yes, executive aggrandizement. It is the gradual, systematic effort by a democratically elected executive to weaken accountability mechanisms and concentrate power.
And the defining feature of executive aggrandizement is that it occurs without suspending the formal democratic architecture.
Right. The leader does not declare martial law or abolish the legislature. Instead, they utilize legal and legislative avenues to quietly remove the teeth from independent watchdogs.
And Jokowi leveraged the structural apathy of the majoritarian public to execute this dismantling with remarkable efficiency.
Let's look at the most prominent example in Mietzner's research, the neutering of the KPK.
The KPK, which is Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission.
Yeah. Established during the Reformasi era, the KPK was designed to be fiercely independent. It had extraordinary powers, including the ability to conduct widespread wiretapping without prior judicial approval, and a mandate to prosecute high-level corruption.
For years, it was consistently ranked as one of the most respected and trusted institutions in the country, right?
Oh, yeah. Frequently arresting cabinet ministers, regional governors, powerful oligarchs.
However, from a purely developmentalist perspective, the KPK was a massive logistical obstacle.
Right, because Jokowi increasingly viewed the agency's aggressive anti-corruption sweeps as a deterrent to foreign investment.
And a bottleneck for his ambitious national infrastructure projects. Local bureaucrats and ministers were becoming paralyzed by the fear of KPK investigations, leading to delays in budget disbursement and project execution.
So, following his decisive re-election in 2019, Jokowi moved to resolve this administrative gridlock. He collaborated with a remarkably compliant legislature to pass a comprehensive revision to the law governing the KPK.
And this 2019 revision effectively gutted the agency's operational independence.
It completely did. It mandated that KPK employees be reclassified as civil servants, stripping them of their independent status and placing them under standard bureaucratic hierarchies.
Furthermore, it established a new supervisory board appointed by the president, which had the authority to approve or deny wiretaps and search warrants.
Now, in the context of post-1998 politics, launching a direct legislative assault on the country's most beloved anti-corruption body would traditionally be viewed as political suicide.
It did spark massive student protests across major cities, right?
It did. But Jokowi did not capitulate to the protests, because he relied entirely on the polling data to gauge the true level of political risk.
And what did the numbers say?
The national surveys revealed a public deeply divided but ultimately leaning toward the executive. 45% of the public supported the revision of the KPK law, while 39% opposed it.
Okay, but the nuanced data regarding political awareness is even more revealing here.
It really is. When pollsters isolated the 60% of the public who were actively following the news and aware of the legislative details, they found that 71% of that informed group fully understood that the revision weakened the KPK's powers.
And despite this understanding, they supported the measure anyway.
Yeah. The majority of the politically engaged electorate recognized that the primary anti-corruption mechanism was being disabled, and they actively endorsed the decision.
Factoring in the entire population, only about 42% expressed critical opposition to the initiative. For a leader governed by majoritarian logic, 42% opposition represents a clear mandate to proceed.
Exactly. The student protests eventually lost momentum, the public attention shifted, and the executive branch successfully neutralized its most pertinent institutional constraint.
And the same majoritarian calculus was applied to the dismantling of the Civil Service Commission, known as the KASN.
Right, the KSN was another post-1998 reform institution specifically created to enforce meritocracy within the sprawling Indonesian bureaucracy.
Historically, local regional heads bupatius and mayors utilized their authority over civil service appointments to run massive patronage networks.
They would essentially sell lucrative civil service positions or award them to political loyalists, ensuring a constant flow of illicit funds and entrenched local power.
The KSN was actually highly effective at auditing these appointments and overturning corrupt local decisions.
But the local politicians, furious at losing their primary mechanism for patronage and illicit income, heavily lobbied the national government to eliminate the oversight body.
Initially, Jokowi defended the KSN, right? He recognized its role in maintaining a professional bureaucracy.
He did, but over time the political calculations shifted. The KSN's interventions were generating intense friction with local executives, and those were the very politicians Jokowi relied upon to execute his national development goals at the regional level.
So, in October 2023, Jokowi quietly acquiesced to the demands of the political elite and agreed with Parliament to simply disband the KASN entirely.
And the public reaction to the total dissolution of a major anti-corruption oversight body? Profound apathy.
It barely registered in the national discourse.
The public indifference was so absolute that major polling agencies did not even conduct surveys to measure sentiment on the issue.
Wow. So Jokowi recognized that the intricate mechanics of civil service reform held zero resonance for the majoritarian voter focused on economic deliverables. He traded away institutional integrity for the administrative compliance of local power brokers, knowing there would be no electoral penalty.
Exactly. And this pattern of executive overreach accelerated dramatically as the 2024 elections approached, particularly concerning interventions in the judiciary to secure his family's political future.
Right. Jokowi was constitutionally barred from seeking a third term, but he was intensely focused on preserving his legacy and his massive infrastructure initiatives. His strategy centered on placing his eldest son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, on the presidential ticket as the vice presidential candidate.
But there was a significant legal barrier to this plan. The Indonesian constitution mandated a strict minimum age requirement of 40 years old for presidential and vice presidential candidates.
And Gibran was only 36.
Right. In a system with robust qualitative checks and balances, the constitutional age limit would be an insurmountable obstacle.
However, in October 2023, the Constitutional Court, the highest judicial body tasked with interpreting the Constitution, issued a deeply controversial and highly specific ruling.
Yeah, the court did not lower the age limit entirely. Instead, it created an exception. It stated that candidates under 40 could run if they had previously been elected as regional heads.
And Gibran, having followed in his father's footsteps as the mayor of Solo, perfectly fit this newly created loophole.
But the critical detail undermining the legitimacy of this ruling was that the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Anwar Usman, was Jokowi's brother-in-law.
Wait, let me just repeat that. The president's brother-in-law presided over a constitutional alteration that directly and exclusively benefited the president's underage son.
Yeah, it's wild. The ethical violations were so egregious that an ethics council subsequently found Anwar Usman guilty of a serious breach of conduct and demoted him from his position as Chief Justice.
But the ruling allowing Gibran to run was permitted to stand.
It was. Blatant judicial nepotism of this magnitude would theoretically ignite a massive public backlash. But Jokowi, as always, consulted the polling data to navigate the fallout.
And the national surveys immediately following the controversial court decision explain exactly why the executive faced no significant consequences. The data showed that 55% of the Indonesian public had not even heard about the Constitutional Court's ruling.
They were completely insulated from the political controversy.
And among the 45% who were aware of the decision, an overwhelming 70% supported the verdict, favoring Gibran's candidacy regardless of the legal machinations required to facilitate it.
And a subsequent poll revealed an even deeper level of civic detachment. 76% of the public had absolutely no idea that the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court was the president's brother-in-law.
The electorate was either completely ignorant of the institutional manipulation or entirely supportive of the outcome because they maintained a deep affinity for Jokowi and his family.
Right. Emboldened by this data, the administration executed a similar maneuver for Jokowi's youngest son, Kiseng Pengarep.
securing a favorable interpretation from the Supreme Court to alter age requirements for local elections, right?
Yes. And the public reaction remained characterized by overwhelming indifference.
This sequence of events perfectly illustrates the mechanics of executive aggrandizement functioning in tandem with majoritarianism. Jokowi did not utilize military force to compel the Electoral Commission to place his son on the ballot.
No, he utilized his deep understanding of structural apathy. He recognized that the majority's baseline satisfaction with his economic performance provided him with sufficient political capital to bend institutional rules.
Without shattering the formal democratic architecture, he applied this exact same majoritarian calculus to directly suppress political dissent, too.
He did. In 2017, navigating a highly polarized environment, Jokowi issued an emergency executive decree. It granted the government the unilateral authority to disband mass organizations without requiring prior approval or a trial through the judicial system.
He bypassed the courts entirely to outlaw Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, or HTI, a hardline Islamist group that advocated for the establishment of a global caliphate.
And legal scholars and liberal civil society groups immediately raised alarms. They warned that granting the executive branch the unilateral power to dissolve organizations established a terrifying legal precedent.
One that could be weaponized against any dissenting group.
Exactly. Jokowi, however, was focused on the polling. The data indicated that 72% of Indonesians had never heard of HTI.
And among the minority who were aware of the organization, their radical ideology was deeply unpopular. Consequently, when the government banned HTI, 78% of the public approved of the action.
We utilized the same emergency powers in 2020 to ban the Front Pembela Islam, or FPI, a militant vigilante group known for conducting raids on religious minorities and entertainment venues.
And once again, 59% of the public supported the dissolution. By carefully selecting targets that the majority actively disliked or were entirely ignorant of, he established a legal mechanism for executive overreach with overwhelming popular consent.
But the suppression of dissent was not limited to radical organizations. During Jokowi's tenure, the government aggressively utilized the law on information and electronic transactions, known as the ite law.
The IT law. This law contained vague provisions criminalizing online defamation and slander, effectively outlawing digital criticism of the government.
And the application of this law skyrocketed, resulting in hundreds of prosecutions. The police even established specialized virtual task forces during the COVID-19 pandemic to actively monitor social media and hunt down citizens posting critical content.
There were 82 documented cases of individuals being prosecuted specifically for insulting the president online.
The aggressive deployment of the IT law generated a severe chilling effect across Indonesian civil society, and the polling data captured the magnitude of this psychological impact.
Yeah, a comprehensive survey conducted in September 2020 revealed that 70% of Indonesians felt increasingly afraid to state their political opinions publicly.
70%.
Mm.
They internalized the threat of digital surveillance and understood the very real risk of prosecution for expressing dissent.
Yet, in the exact same polling environment, addressing the same demographic, 69% of respondents reported that they were satisfied with how democracy was functioning in Indonesia.
Right.
As a student of history, how do you reconcile a population terrified to speak but entirely happy with their democracy? It's like reviewing a restaurant saying the food is poisonous, but giving it 5 stars for the ambiance.
Right. To reconcile a population that is mathematically terrified to express basic political opinions, yet simultaneously highly satisfied with the state of their democracy, you have to return to the core concept of developmentalism. If a citizen defines democracy primarily through the availability of employment, the construction of toll roads, and the maintenance of social order, then the systematic erosion of civil liberties is simply not factored into their assessment of democratic health.
And the citizens being arrested under the IT law were primarily activists, members of the marginalized liberal 9% or hardline Islamist critics.
Yes, for the moderate, mainstream voter focused on economic survival, a localized campaign of digital repression was an entirely acceptable concession in exchange for macroeconomic stability. Jokowi curtailed fundamental civic freedoms, and the majority rewarded him for maintaining order.
But Jokowi wasn't completely unchecked. There were lines he tried to cross where the studio audience dial suddenly turned bright red.
Yes, his majoritarian philosophy contained inherent constraints. There were specific boundaries where public opinion rigidly opposed executive action.
And the ultimate test of this dynamic emerged regarding the most sacred pillar of the 1998 Reformasi architecture, the 2-term presidential limit.
Right, because as Jokowi approached the final years of his second term, the administration actively explored avenues to extend his tenure.
The pursuit of a third term involved high-level constitutional plotting. The source material details how Jokowi authorized his inner circle to develop strategic scenarios for amending the Constitution.
A key architect of this strategy was Bambang Suisatyo, the head of the People's Consultative Assembly, or NPR, which is the only body with the authority to alter the Constitution.
And they conceptualized this highly orchestrated political maneuver. The plan called for Jokowi to travel abroad on a minor religious pilgrimage, projecting an image of pious detachment from domestic politics.
Right, and during his absence, the NPR would rapidly convene in a special session and ram through a constitutional amendment abolishing the presidential term limits.
It was essentially a calculated strategy for a constitutional coup. However, the plan disintegrated when it confronted the reality of public opinion.
A polling wall.
Yes. The polls finally bit back. Jokowi's trusted network of pollsters delivered the data in September 2021, and the numbers represented an insurmountable political barrier. An overwhelming 84% of respondents demanded that the two-term limit be strictly maintained.
84%. The public was fiercely and immovably opposed to altering the foundational rule that prevented a return to dictatorship.
Even when pollsters personalized the question asking specifically if Jokowi, given his high approval ratings, should be allowed to run again, 48% said no, compared to only 30% who supported an extension.
Right. The electorate deeply approved of his performance, but the generational trauma of Suharto's endless autocracy dictated that his time in power must end.
And that data induced panic within the executive's inner circle. Senior Minister Luhut Panjaitan, one of Jokowi's most powerful and influential allies, attempted a desperate public relations offensive to change the narrative.
He publicly claimed to possess massive, proprietary big data, analyzing the sentiment of 110 million Indonesian internet users.
Right, and he asserted that the secret data proved the silent majority actually demanded an extension of Jokowi's presidency.
But the claim was widely mocked by political scientists and data analysts as a blatant attempt to manufacture a fabricated mandate.
And crucially, Jokowi himself rejected his minister's fabricated narrative. Jokowi, the ultimate polling purist, refused to buy the fake data. He had built his entire career on the accuracy of conventional, scientifically rigorous public opinion surveys.
He recognized that the mathematical reality was unambiguous. The public would not tolerate a constitutional amendment.
Consequently, he formally abandoned the pursuit of a third term. But the administration didn't immediately surrender the objective of extending his influence. They pivoted to alternative strategies.
Yeah, in mid-2022, the administration floated Plan B. They proposed a formal election delay.
Disguised as COVID-19 compensation.
Exactly. The political justification argued that the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic had essentially stolen 2 years of Jokowi's presidency, severely disrupting his timeline for completing massive infrastructure projects.
Including the construction of a brand new capital city in Borneo.
Right, so the administration argued that rather than seeking an unconstitutional third term, Jokowi should be granted a 2 or 3 year extension to fulfill his developmental promises.
And they tested this narrative against public opinion?
And the polling data was equally decisive. 80% of the public vehemently opposed any delay to the 2024 elections, regardless of the economic or logistical justifications provided.
Recognizing the absolute lack of majoritarian support, Plan B was discarded.
So then the administration escalated to Plan C, a proposition that would have fundamentally dismantled democratic participation at the grassroots level.
Pitched by ministers Tito Karnavian and Luhut. Right. The plan was to abolish direct local elections.
Right. They advocated reverting to an elite-driven system where regional heads, mayors, and governors were appointed by the central government or local parliaments.
And it is at this exact juncture that Jokowi's strict adherence to majoritarianism paradoxically functioned as the ultimate defense mechanism for Indonesian democracy. He flat out refused.
He reportedly confronted his ministers, pointing directly to the data, saying, "Haven't you seen the polls? The people want direct elections."
He understood intrinsically that the public fiercely guarded their right to directly vote for their local representatives. He similarly rejected an aggressive proposal by Luhut to grant the president the unilateral authority to appoint the head of the Supreme Court, recognizing that such a brazen power grab lacked any popular mandate.
So what does this all mean? It reminds me of a velociraptor testing the electric fences in Jurassic Park. He tests the constitutional boundaries, gets shocked by the poll numbers, and retreats. Why didn't he just turn off the fence?
To fully understand the significance of Jokowi's restraint, we actually need to contrast him with leaders in other developing democracies facing similar term limits. Consider President Nayib Bukele in El Salvador.
The world's coolest dictator, as he calls himself. Yeah, confronting constitutional term limits. Bukele utilized his immense popularity to systematically replace the judges on the Constitutional Court with political loyalists, and they subsequently issued a ruling allowing him to run for consecutive terms, openly embracing an autocratic posture.
And in Senegal, President Macky Sall attempted to forcefully delay national elections to manipulate the succession process, triggering massive civil unrest.
Right. Now look at Jokowi. He possessed the 80% approval rating, he possessed the pliant legislature, and he possessed an immense state apparatus. Yet he did not cross that final threshold.
He didn't command the military to secure the parliament and force a constitutional amendment.
Because his majoritarian philosophy dictated that his power was entirely derived from the tolerance of the electorate. If the quantitative data demonstrated that the majority would not tolerate an action, he simply would not execute it.
He lacked the ideological fanaticism or the raw authoritarian impulse required to rule by absolute force in the absence of popular consent.
Exactly. But, prevented from remaining in office directly or delaying the electoral calendar, Jokowi had to pivot to secure his legacy projects. This imperative drove the aggressive, highly controversial tactics deployed during the 2024 presidential transition.
Right. We established how he leveraged the Constitutional Court to secure his son's placement on the ballot. He subsequently mobilized the vast resources of the Indonesian state to ensure the victory of the Prabowo Gibran ticket.
And the scale of this intervention was monumental. In the months leading up to the February 2024 election, the Jokowi administration initiated a massive, targeted distribution of state social assistance, known as Bansos.
These welfare funds and food distributions dwarfed even the emergency economic relief provided during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Jokowi personally toured critical battleground provinces, heavily associating the massive influx of state aid with his administration and, by extension, the Prabowo Gibran campaign.
Meanwhile, Prabowo himself underwent a massive political rebranding. The former Special Forces commander shed his hardline nationalistic image and adopted a highly curated grandfatherly persona popularly known as Jamoy, or cute and cuddly.
Designed specifically to appeal to younger voters and soften his historical reputation.
And critics and election watchdogs argued forcefully that the unprecedented deployment of state welfare funds constituted systemic, state-sponsored vote buying, representing a severe degradation of electoral fairness.
But despite the intense criticism regarding the abuse of state resources, the polling data once again validated Jokowi's strategy. A massive 75% of respondents explicitly stated that Jokowi possessed the political right to actively support a successor who would protect his developmental legacy.
75%. Only 21% believe the incumbent president had a democratic obligation to remain neutral.
And following the decisive landslide victory of Prabowo and Gibran, 76% of the public reported they were entirely satisfied with the execution and fairness of the 2024 elections.
So he fundamentally compromised the neutrality of the democratic process, but he executed the maneuver with the overwhelming quantifiable blessing of the electorate.
This specific methodology is frequently categorized broadly as populism. But Meissner's research introduces a crucial academic distinction here. He differentiates between classic populism and a more nuanced phenomenon termed popularism.
Okay, let's explore that. Classic populism, defined by foundational scholars like Cas Mudde, relies on a thin-centered ideology. It requires a leader to rhetorically divide society into two inherently hostile camps: the pure, virtuous, ordinary citizens struggling against a corrupt, predatory elite establishment.
And the populist leader positions themselves as the sole authentic voice capable of destroying the elites to liberate the people.
Right, and Jokowi frequently utilized this populist framing, particularly early in his career, projecting the image of a humble political outsider fighting entrenched corruption.
But the divergence lies in the application of power. Classic populists are inherently polarizing. Their objective is to dismantle the existing elite structures.
Right.
Jokowi, however, was defined by intense pragmatism. He practiced popularism, utilizing the populist rhetoric to build massive approval ratings. But behind closed doors, he systematically incorporated the very elites he publicly criticized into his governing coalition.
He appointed media oligarchs and powerful tycoons to his cabinet to ensure favorable coverage and parliamentary stability.
And the ultimate expression of this pragmatism was his decision following the deeply polarizing 2019 election to appoint his bitter rival, Prabowo Subianto, as the Minister of Defense.
He integrated his primary opponent into the heart of the executive branch.
Yeah, Jokowi rationalized this by stating that presidents must make compromises to protect their agenda, noting that the art of governance is simply not giving the elites too much because they will always demand more.
He traded away the purity of institutional reform for the political stability necessary to execute his infrastructure project.
Exactly. To synthesize Jokowi's historical position, the source material explicitly contrasts him with major global autocrats.
Right. Why he isn't Putin or Erdogan.
Exactly. He is fundamentally not a Vladimir Putin or a Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Putin and Erdogan possess the ideological ambition to systematically tear down the existing state and construct entirely new, permanent, personalized autocratic architectures designed to guarantee their rule indefinitely.
Jokowi possessed no such ideological blueprint.
No, he didn't construct a new authoritarian system. He merely utilized majoritarian support to temporarily disable the alarms on the existing democratic institutions to facilitate his specific economic objectives.
So he's not remodeling the state, he's just strategically ignoring the rule book when it suits him.
Right. The research actually suggests his trajectory is much closer to what we see with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India.
The Modi parallel.
Yes. Both leaders command massive domestic popularity. Both operate complex, highly effective forms of majoritarianism. Modi mobilizes a powerful ethno-religious majoritarianism centered on Hindu nationalism, utilizing the massive institutional machinery of the BJP party.
While Jokowi mobilized a developmentalist majoritarianism, relying entirely on his personal popularity and polling data, as he lacked a dominant institutional party vehicle.
But despite the differing mechanisms, the outcomes are strikingly similar. Both presided over a massive, verifiable decline in the qualitative health of their democratic institutions.
Yet, because both leaders meticulously maintained the formal architecture of multi-party elections and commanded undeniable majoritarian support, they have successfully avoided the international pariah status assigned to traditional dictators.
They are heavily courted, praised, and legitimized by the global democratic community, successfully achieving autocratic domestic goals without facing systemic international isolation.
That brings us back to the central mission of this analysis. Let's bring this home for the listener who is analyzing this for their university thesis. Based on the expansive historical context, the granular polling data, and the mechanics of his executive decisions, ultimately, is Joko Widodo a defective Democrat who compromised his principles for progress, or is he an unfinished autocrat who simply ran out of time?
The synthesis of Mietzner's extensive research concludes that he is undeniably both.
Both.
He operates as an unfinished autocrat because he consistently, systematically pushed against the boundaries of executive power, actively dismantling accountability mechanisms. Yet he stopped short of total constitutional destruction purely because the polling data dictated the limits of public tolerance.
Right.
But he is simultaneously a defective Democrat because he utilized the precise instruments of democracy, public opinion, and majoritarian consent to actively hollow out the qualitative checks and balances necessary for the system's long-term survival.
His greatest, most unsettling political achievement was successfully curtailing democratic integrity for his own political and dynastic benefit, without the majority of his citizens or the international community really viewing it as a crisis. We have examined how a highly popular executive does not require military force to dismantle democratic guardrails. They merely need to identify the blind spots in the electorate's priorities.
By understanding that the public prioritized infrastructure and jobs over anti-corruption commissions and judicial independence, Jokowi used majoritarianism as a scalpel. He surgically removed the institutional constraints that hindered his agenda while preserving the electoral mechanisms that guaranteed his legitimacy.
If you take one thing away from this deep dive, let it be this. The resilience of a democracy cannot be measured solely by the text of its constitution or the existence of its independent agencies. The ultimate defense of a democratic system is entirely dependent on the hierarchy of values held by its citizens.
If a population consistently signals through its voting patterns and polling responses that it prioritizes economic deliverables above the mechanics of justice, transparency, and oversight, savvy and pragmatic leaders will inevitably trade away those structural checks and balances to fulfill the majoritarian demand.
The formal architecture of the Indonesian state remains standing, but the qualitative substance within has been fundamentally altered. This reality presents a deeply challenging philosophical puzzle that the research points toward, something for you to mull over.
If the core theoretical definition of a democracy is the execution of the popular will, and a massive informed population freely and consciously chooses to endorse a leader who systematically dismantles their democratic institutions in exchange for economic prosperity, is that outcome a tragic failure of the democratic experiment? Or is it, paradoxically, the absolute purest expression of it?
It is a question that challenges the foundation of how we measure political success. Thank you for joining us for this extensive analysis. This has been episode 2 of Reading CA. We will see you on the next deep dive.